Buenos días y buenas tardes.
Good day, good afternoon to all of you. I am Joshua Paternina Blanco. I'm a public policy analyst in the International Transport Forum, and it is my honor to welcome you to this event, Public Policy Scenarios for Decarbonizing Argentina's Transport System. It is also my pleasure to be the moderator for the first half of the session of this event. Technical information before we begin. We will have interpretation from English into Spanish. If you want to hear the interpretation, please click on the globe icon that appears in the bottom part of the screen and choose the language you prefer. Please do not click mute original audio because it might bring about technical problems. Just choose your language and listen to the sessions in that language. During the session, you will be able to use the chat feature. Our team will be sharing interesting information for everyone. In any case, in some of today's sessions, you will be able to have questions and answers. That's why we will ask you to use the Q&A session, feature from Zoom. This is today's agenda. First of all, we will have some opening remarks and welcome from some of the authorities who have been participating in the organization of this project and event. Then we will have a session in which we will see the design and results of the decarbonization public policy scenarios for Argentina. We will have a short coffee break, and then we will begin a new session with Latin American countries' authorities to revise the policy implications and implementation feasibility for the policies implemented in the region. Then we will have another debate session that is also related to the policy implications and implementation feasibility, but in Argentina. And we will have then finally some closing statements. Without further ado, let me introduce the different panel members who will be opening this event. First of all, we will hear Mr. Marcos Farina. He is the Interjurisdictional Articulation Secretary for the Ministry of Transport in Argentina. We will also hear Elizabeth Wendish. She's the Deputy Director of the Quantitative and Prospective Department of the ITF, and she's also the leader of the DTEE project. We will also hear Maria Rosa Muiro. She is the researcher for the Wuppertal Institute, and she's the coordination of the Solution Plus program for Latin America. We will finally hear Claudia Alvarez. She is a representative of the Environmental, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Security Ministry for Germany. Without any further ado, I would like to thank all the panel members for inviting and being here. And I will give the floor to Mr. Marcos Farina. Good morning, good day to you all. On behalf of the Ministry of Transport of Argentina, Alexis Herrera, I would like to thank you all, the Secretary General of the ITF, Joshua Paternina Blanco, and everyone for organizing this presentation. Particularly, I would like to thank Claudia Alvarez, the Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Security Minister for Germany, for making this project possible. I would like to thank Maria Rosa Munoz and the whole Institute for their cooperation when it came to preparing the scenario report for decarbonization of transport that we will be hearing by Gustavo Rinaldi on behalf of Argentina. I would also like to thank the Chilean experts, also the experts from Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico who are joining us today. Argentina has a huge commitment towards international efforts to stop the progress of climatic change. On September, the president ratified the commitment to increase at 2% of GHG emissions in Argentina during the Glasgow Climate Summit. This means that there will be a 27.7% commitment that is higher than the one that was undertaken in 2016 when the government was a different one. In this scenario, transport has a key role. Argentina is the 8th largest country in the world and a producer and exporter of food, which entails complex logistics. That's why transport is accountable for 14% of emissions and is the second source of GHG emissions nationally. To modernize it and optimize it and investigate new technologies will be key to reduce those emissions in developing countries. The time to act is now. And in our country, we are already working on this. We are working with multimodality and mode share, relating it to different transport means to create synergy between them and make them more efficient. We're also placing bets on freight trains and passenger trains. We're promoting sustainable mobility and non-motorized transport. We're pushing forward towards the transition of the energy grid for freight transport to natural gas. We are updating our ports and our waterways. Gustavo will talk about this in detail. The pandemic has shown us that there are challenges that affect the whole of the humanity, like climate change. And this can only be overcome if we work hand in hand with other nations. That is why these meetings are so important when it comes to exchanging experiences, knowledge, and resources. Thank you very much to all of you for this such a valuable meeting and such an important meeting for the region and the world. Well, it is our pleasure to hear you, Mr. Secretary. Let me then give the floor to Elizabeth Wendish.
Thank you, Joshua. Welcome to everyone on behalf of the ITF, and thank you also from my side for joining this event of our Decarbonizing Transport in Argentina project. As many of you will know, decarbonizing transport has become one of the 5 focus areas of the International Transport Forum. And in this context, the ITF has also launched its Decarbonizing Transport initiative in 2016 after the signing of the Paris Agreement. And very soon after, we started shaping this project, the Decarbonizing Transport in Emerging Economies project, which could then finally take off in early 2019. Our desire with this project has been to provide direct support to some of our member countries and work directly with the ministries of transport to help them transform the climate ambitions into action and develop pathways to a low carbon transport system with work. And so we are supporting today in the context of this so-called DTEE project 4 countries in 4 different regions, namely Argentina, Azerbaijan, India, and Morocco. And we're hoping that with this spread of the countries, the project will have a true global reach with our project outputs. And so now to Argentina. Argentina has been the first of the countries that was on board with this project. And it was not only the first on board, they, or you, I should say, have been very enthusiastically on board since the very beginning of the project. And we have since learned how serious Argentina is with its ambitions to reduce transport CO2 emissions, and also what immense capacity and knowledge you have within the ministry, what excellent tools you have to carry out assessments of policy scenarios, and how you have been making use of them to develop roadmaps for the future of our transport system. So while this was all great news for us at the beginning of the project, it also meant that it was a bit trickier for us to understand how we as at the ITF can contribute within the context of this project and how we can actually provide value with this project to the Ministry of Transport. But well, looking at the program today and all the work that has been done to date, I think we can proudly say that together with you, our partners in the ministry, we have figured it out. We have been able to develop together something very insightful for Argentina, something that will hopefully also have repercussions and raise interest within other countries in the region, some of which I believe are joining us today. I'm really looking forward to today's event and want to thank on behalf of the ITF all project partners that were involved, and of course, above all, our excellent partners within the Argentinian Ministry of Transport, who have allowed this project to become such a success. We are confident that this excellent relationship with you all will continue and will lead to further very relevant project outputs also in the coming years, because the project has not come to an end yet, obviously. I also want to thank the German Ministry for the Environment, the BMU, who have made this project possible thanks to the International Climate Initiative and the funding that was provided within that framework. And especially I want to say that the BMU has been very supportive over the past 2 years during these pandemic years to make sure that we can actually deliver this project despite the difficult circumstances. And they have allowed us to move to fully virtual events very early on to make sure that we would not have any project delays and can actually continue to work as almost as usual, I would say. So I would really like to take the opportunity today also to thank Claudia, who is here, representing the German Ministry and the International Climate Initiative for this excellent cooperation, specifically over this past 1.5 years. And lastly, and very importantly, I also want to thank the ITF project team who have worked relentlessly over the past 2.5 years on this project, and who have, thanks to this work, opened the door for the ITF in Latin America, have helped to increase the reputation and relevance of the ITF in the region. And you will get to know them all in the course of this event, and I'm really looking forward to that. And I will leave it here. Thank you all very much again. And I will now hand back to Joshua to introduce you to the next speaker. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Elizabeth, por esas palabras.
Thank you,
Ahora-
Elizabeth, for those kind words. I will now give the floor to Maria Rosa. Thank you very much, Joshua. I will quickly share a very brief presentation about the Wuppertal Institute. Can you confirm that you can see my screen? Yes. Great. Good day to all of you. It is a pleasure for me to be here. As Joshua said, I am a researcher at the Wuppertal Institute for Climate, Environment, and Energy, and I have been coordinating there for more than 3 years the unit for Latin America. In these 5 minutes, I will be very briefly presenting the Wuppertal Institute, their activities in the region, and its particular role in the project of decarbonizing transport in emerging economies. For those of you who are not aware of this, the Wuppertal Institute is a German institute that does applied research since 1991 on climate, environment, and energy. We're about 250 employees. The main branch, the head office is in Wuppertal, an industrial city in northwestern Germany, but we also have an office in Berlin, from where most of the Mobility and International Cooperation Research Unit works from, which I represent. As you can see here, this unit belongs to the Division of Energy, Transport, and Climate Policy. In order for projects that we work on to be comprehensively implemented, our focus is based on 5 pillars that you can see here. First of all, we want to provide our counterparts a series of tools, methods, and guides that enable the implementation of sustainable mobility solutions. We also create a platform to foster peer-to-peer exchange, which has yielded extremely profitable results in Latin America due to the language and the situations. We also have synergic and collaborative projects. We support cities in the implementation of pilot projects, or urban labs, as we call them, so that they can test different solutions. And finally, we help in identification and generation of policies and funding and finance this business decision-making processes. With this in mind, I would like to tell you a little bit more about the other projects that we're working on in the region. We have the Urban Pathways project that is also funded by the IKI and the German Climate Environment. This project will be finishing this year, and we have supported the cities of Belo Horizonte and other cities in the region in the implementation of pilot projects and urban labs related to active mobility, to road safety in school contexts, and with tools, tactical tools, and the integration of other sectors. The second project is the Solution Plus project. It is a project funded by the Horizon 2020 of the EU. It started in 2020 and it will last for 4 years. That is, by the end of 2023, it will finish, and we are trying to implement electric mobility or e-mobility pilot projects in 10 cities, and Latin America, it will be implemented in Quito and Montevideo. And finally, the third project we're working on has already been approved by IKI, and that is the Access project. We are trying to improve the transport in Quito. This is the project that will begin in 2023 and will finish in 2026. For this project, we're working with 6 countries in the region. Among one of those is Argentina.
Well, delving into the project of decarbonizing the system of transport in Argentina, what is the role of the Wuppertal Institute in the project, especially in the work that we have conducted in Argentina? In the project, our mission is to work with at the local level, identifying the technical and capacity building needs, developing local policy scenarios that are able to be articulated at the national level, and also to assess the mitigation measures to assess the local ability for NDCs, and also to develop capacity building materials in cooperation with local universities. We are working with the Universidad of San Martin University, and finally to identify other countries in the region in order to exchange experiences. In this context, the cities that we have pre-selected together with the Transport Ministry is Resistencia, Tucumán, and Neuquén cities. What we have identified is the planning of sustainable urban mobility, public transport promotion, active mobility, urban logistics, and also urban electric mobility solutions. All of these topics, the idea is to address them comprehensively, reinforcing mobility plans and focusing on decarbonizing mobility. Within this context, we have moved forward. In September and October, we held a local program of training in 2021, and we address the light mobility vehicles. In the second module, we cooperated strongly with the program of decarbonizing transport in emerging economies with the participation of the International Transport Forum, which presented the initial results in Argentina that were presented today in the policy scenario for decarbonizing transport. And we also had the participation of several initiatives in Argentina related to low carbon transport. We had some presentations in Rosario, and also the logistics pilot plan, and also the participation of Mercado Libre, and Buenos Aires City also participated at the local level. So we are moving ahead in terms of training, and we'll continue moving forward in these topics as the project moves along. So these are the people who are working in the project, Sonny Coricula and myself. Here is our information. Please do not hesitate in contacting us if you have any questions. Thank you very much. Thank you, Maria Rosa. I'll give the floor now to Claudia Alvarez. Thank you very much. Honorable Secretary Farina and representatives of the Transport Ministry of Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and Chile, dear colleagues of the International Transport Forum and the Wuppertal Institute. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Good morning in Latin America and good afternoon for those of you in Europe. My name is Claudia Alvarez and I work as a responsible manager of this project of DTEE that we have mentioned many times so far for the International Initiative of Climate, the IKA. My organization is the ZUG here in Berlin. On behalf of the Federal Ministry of Environment and Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety, BMU, it's an honor to welcome you to this webinar, to this virtual webinar. I'm not sure if this word exists, but I'm pretty sure it does. With this title, Decarbonizing transport system in Argentina. Policy scenarios. As we know, climate change is moving forward. Natural catastrophes are wreaking havoc in the planet, and we see how the concentrations of greenhouse gas emissions are on the rise, and the negative effects of climate change are being felt around the world. In order to fulfill the climate commitments of the Paris Agreement by 2050, times are wasting. We cannot afford to waste any time. So the coronavirus pandemic makes everyone think, because we are all afraid for our own health and also the health of our families, and also because of the lack of economic livelihoods. Companies have been threatened in their economic existence, and the current situation shows it very clearly. In a globalized world, we are all responsible for our well-being and the well-being of others. So that is why we believe it is crucial to face climate change together with our partners around the world. While it may seem in the light of the pandemic, maybe the fight against the climate change cannot be on the same footing, but the solutions of both challenges go hand in hand. The green recovery oriented to climate gives us this opportunity. The sustainable design will provide us the opportunity of an economic recovery, and at the same time, it will foster recovery in the long term of both the economy and societies toward a greater economic and climate protection. Since 2008, the IKI from BMU on the Initiative of Diversity and Climate on emerging countries and developing countries, I would like to stress the importance of the transport sector, especially with the attention placed on urban freight in order to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. Within the coronavirus pandemic, the sector of urban freight has increased, and the level of emissions associated have increased as well. Taking into account that the transport section accounts for 1/4 of all the emissions of carbon dioxide related to the energy in the atmosphere, the IKI has an increasing portfolio of projects related to sustainable mobility. Currently, there are 18 ongoing projects around the world with a total funding of 120 million euros from 23 countries that support the transformation of their transport system. Some other 3 projects are underway with total funds of 36 million euros. And we also have a bilateral project with Argentina, and the transport sector is one of the main components. In emerging economies, the booming economic growth and urbanization have led to an increase of the demand of transport and the intensification of motorization. That trend has brought about an increase of emissions of greenhouse gases, as well as atmospheric pollution. It is likely that transport emissions will continue to increase at an even faster pace than other sectors. As a consequence, in order to decarbonize transport, we need to implement policy and mitigation measures that are immediate, effective, and sustainable. That is essential to reach the common goals of the stabilization of climate, such as clean air in the cities. That is why the project of decarbonizing transport in emerging economies, which is implemented in Argentina, India, Azerbaijan, and Morocco, it is crucial for us. Together, we want to promote a global approach on decarbonizing transport. That means developing a coherent policy that are effective and that are coordinated with the civil society and the private sector. I am pleased to state that within this project, we are based in the cooperation that we've had with our partners, especially in Argentina. And we hope to develop together measures to reach our goals of climate protection in the transport sector. I'm sure that this webinar will entail a major contribution of the current debate in Argentina, but also beyond. In this context, we are pleased to support these activities. I will be remiss if I didn't thank all the people who have participated in the organization of this event, especially all the colleagues from ITF and from the Wuppertal Institute, but of course, all the people that I haven't personally mentioned. Without you, this would not be possible. I wish you all a very interesting presentation of the results of the different policy scenarios for the decarbonization of freight transport in Argentina, and very fruitful debates. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mrs. Alvarez, for your intervention, which is a great transition to our second session on the design and the results of the public policies that we have presented before. In the second session, the team from the ITF will present what is the methodological framework of their work. And to that end, I will introduce two of my colleagues, Francisco Furtado. He is a modeler and analyst of transport here at the forum, and he's the head of the project of decarbonization activities in Argentina within the DTEE project. Also to my colleague, John Preach, who is also an analyst of public policies and modeler of transport. Francisco, John, the floor is yours.
I'll start by sharing my screen. Okay, wait. Okay. And I think we are getting there. Okay, I think just confirm that you are watching the correct presentation.
Yes, we are.
Perfect. So, good morning to all that are listening in South America. Buenos dias, e muitos bons dias também para aqueles que nos estão ligados a partir do Brasil também. E grande cumprimento e abraço para eles e elas. Well, so I will here, and me and my colleague John, I will give here a big overview of the last stage of the last component that we've been working on this project. And I'll be presenting and providing this overview on this most recent publication of ours, which quantifies the impacts of different scenarios to decarbonize transport in Argentina. In the chat, for those that are watching, in the chat, I've already put some links to this report, both which is available both in English and in Spanish. And I will be presenting here in English, but you can, there's the translation to Spanish, and the report itself, it's also in Spanish. And I won't go through all of the publication, all of the report, but I'll still hit all of the main highlights of it and focus on the main parts and the main conclusions of this work. And the first thing to say is that designing these scenarios, doing this quantitative work was not done in a vacuum. So this was a result of an ongoing project, like my colleague Elizabeth mentioned. It started in 2019. We had a fact-finding mission in Argentina. We've already published on this project a scoping report where we explore the current situation of the transport system and the prospects of decarbonizing transport in Argentina. In this report, we also already had some guidelines for the future steps in this project. Just last year, we did this big virtual conference in the wake of the COVID crisis, where we grouped lots of stakeholders from Argentina, also throughout South and Latin America, to discuss these challenges. And all of that fed into this work of designing the scenarios, and also helped us to identify some critical issues that needed to be tackled. I'll start by saying that also, and I think Secretary Marcos Farina from the Argentinian Transport Ministry actually alluded to the fact that this project is very focused on the freight component, given its big importance in Argentina. And to start with the data point is that in transport, most of the emissions in transport in Argentina come from road freight and from trucks, which is not the case in all the countries in the world. This is actually Argentina. This is not the case in most countries, but given the structure of the economy and geography of the country, this is actually the case there. And even in the Argentinian plans, most of the ambition to cut emissions from transport naturally comes from freight, since it's the sector that emits more. And hence, since the start of the project, this was a bit the focus on this for this particular country. Now, this design of the scenarios, while we were doing these fact-finding missions, in contacts, organizing the conference we did last year, we were always moving towards this design of these scenarios. And so we worked in this in strict cooperation with the Transport Ministry in Argentina. We had several exchanges with officials from the ministry, with external experts, people from academia, from different backgrounds. And we had several formal, inclusively workshops, where we discussed the parameters, the type of the scenarios that we were gonna test. And all of that work came together in these 7 scenarios. One scenario is, of course, a baseline, but a baseline which is not static. Attention, there's still improvements in this scenario. The declared policies that are already assumed by the countries are taken into account. There's also a scenario on increasing the attractiveness of intermodal solutions, namely rail, or solutions that have a rail and an inland waterways, hidrovias component, but which also includes improvements to the overall infrastructure, including road infrastructure, and improvements even in border crossings, which might not be from the infrastructure side, might be improvements on digitalization and ease of procedures and administrative procedures in border crossings. Another scenario is the complete fleet renewal of the truck fleet, the trucks that are used for non-urban transport between cities and even for longer distances. So this heavier trucks fleet is completely renewed up to when we get to 2030. And it's not only renewed, but also with a transition to gas. Another scenario, the 4th scenario, is the electrification of the urban fleet. And by urban, we mean the delivery, the urban freight fleet. So all of the vehicles that do deliveries and move freight inside urban areas in Argentina transition to electricity by 2032. Then another scenario is the impacts of e-commerce, of an increase in e-commerce, not just in Argentina, but globally. And how will that affect Argentina? Then another scenario 6, has to do with global trends. And I must say from the beginning, one of the added values the ITF could bring to the table, and Elizabeth was mentioning this challenge that we had, because in Argentina there was already modeling tools established, there was already a lot of know-how, but one element where the ITF could add value, and we realized this from the beginning in dialogue with the experts in Argentina, was to see how international changes, even infrastructure, but also other global trends, how could this affect transport and in Argentina, and help or not to decarbonize the transport sector. So there's here several global trends that we tested together, including carbon taxes, trade regionalization, 3D printing, slow steaming, higher fees, port fees, and even changes to the main commodities that are traded. That most of it comes actually from these trends. And then the last scenario was a scenario, of course, where we combine all of these trends and all of these policies. They're all simulated together to check what would be the result in this situation. Just a note here, for this work, we used the ITF global freight model. It is the same model that we applied in other projects, most notably the Outlook, the Transport Outlook, which is the ITF flagship publication. This Outlook is global. This model that we use is also a global model. So although we are testing things in Argentina and for Argentina, all the world, I mean, when we run this model and these simulations, all the world transport system is impacted. We get results for the entire world too. And one of the things, or one of the challenges we had, and my colleague John next will explain this a bit better, but one of the challenges we had is that we generally use this model to evaluate what happens globally, or to evaluate what happens in regions, world regions, like Latin America and the Caribbean, Europe, East Asia. So we generally don't apply this to a specific country. And to do this for a specific country, we had to implement several updates and upgrades to the model to be able to have an analysis with this level of detail, and then to set up these specific scenarios too. But now I pass the word to John to talk about this.
Thank you very much, Francisco. As Francisco just mentioned, this is part of this ITF framework for global freight models. And it's important to highlight that this is usually done at the global scale. And here for Argentina, we really had to go in depth. And it's one of the first times that we've used this model in such detail to give results for a particular country. In addition to just a general validation of the transport network, one of the important things for our intermodal scenario and our combined scenario was that we looked at future improvements to the network that were already planned in Argentina, whether it was improvements, new border crossings or tunnels into Chile, or improvements to the capacity of roads. And this was incorporated. So these would come in at the appropriate year. Next, Francisco, please. In addition, it was really important for us to incorporate the emission factors of the different vehicles that were being used for freight, because the outputs of the model was getting the emissions of all this transport. In Argentina, to do this, we were using the IEA's mobility model, commonly referred to as the MOMO model. And it's important to highlight, as you can see in the table here, that in Argentina, inland waterways tend to have pretty low emission factors, whereas their heavy trucks, which Francisco already mentioned, tends to be older. An older fleet tends to have higher emissions than in other parts of the world, such as in Germany and the United States. Next, please. additionally, because we're looking at the international freight for Argentina, for us, it was really, really important to make sure that Argentina's foreign trade was actually accurately represented in our model. To do that, we went through a validation process together with the Argentina partners of the ministry to ensure that what our model was showing matched reality. In the case of Argentina, most of the foreign trade, as you can imagine, is by maritime transport, but there are important connections through other modes. Next. To this point, another important thing that we had to do was to make sure that the freight was being passed through the correct entry and exit points in Argentina. In our case, what we found was that 5 ports, and were the most important ports in Argentina, really accounted for most of the ports entry and exit points. And these are Buenos Aires, San Martín, San Lorenzo, Rosario, Timbúes, Bahía Blanca, which accounted for almost 80%. So this is something that we went through a lot of care to make sure that these ports were accurately represented in our international model. Next, please. And additionally, we wanted to make sure that the mode share of the surface freight activity was accurately represented in Argentina. In Argentina, as you all know, road freight accounts for most of the freight internally. We estimate 86%, which is a similar percentage to what the Argentina model indicates. And additionally, inland waterways plays an important role in Argentina with 10%. And the rail is expected to be 4%, but one of the things that we're testing is whether this would be growing in the future. But to us, it was really important to have a baseline that was accurate so that we could present results of our scenarios that were useful and based in reality. Next, Francisco. And to this point, one of the things that we did, can you move on to the next slide, please? Sorry, yes. One of the things that we did was that we also validated the allocation of the transfer flows in the model, in the network. Obviously, these are different results because we have different models, but we wanted to make sure that the flows were similar to the flows that they had from the cargo and logistics department in Argentina. And that was the last thing that we did, to make sure that the flows are being distributed throughout the country in a way that was accurate and therefore useful in our results. I think that's what I have for you today. I'm going to pass the word back to Francisco, and he's going to go a little bit more into details on the results of how the scenarios worked out.
Thank you, John, for this run of the upgrades we did, and gives a little flavor of the methodology that we deployed. And so now I'll dive into the results. First, starting with the activity, with the transport activity itself, the generally measured in ton kilometers. And so what we can see, and this is for surface transport inside Argentina, which includes both domestic and international movements, but everything that takes place inside Argentina. And when you look at it, you see there's a growing trend for freight movements, but which is more or less in line with what happens globally. Actually, if you look at the ITF estimates for the global developments, Argentina follows a bit those trends. It doesn't grow as fast as, for instance, what we see in Asia and Africa, but it does grow a bit faster. It's still a bit more than other more consolidated economies like Europe or United States and Canada. And that's in the baseline. When you compare what happens in the baseline to what happens in all of these scenarios that we tested, one first interesting result is that there is an increase in activity in the intermodal and infrastructure scenario. So improving the infrastructure, fostering intermodality will also foster transport activity inside Argentina. Then, as it would be expected, e-commerce will also push the demand higher inside Argentina for transport. And interestingly enough, the same also happens in this global trend scenario. This trend scenario also includes e-commerce. It has other things that I described, but there's also an increase inside Argentina. This is an interesting because outside it's not exactly the same, but there's an increase inside Argentina for the surface transport. And in this combined scenario, which combines everything, it takes in what happens in the intermodal scenario and better infrastructure. It also takes in this e-commerce. So there's also an increase in activity and general transport activity when you combine everything. An interesting detail of this activity is what happens in terms of modal shifts and surface modal shares. Because we start, as was already mentioned, with the overwhelming percentage of activity being done by road. It's the dominant mode, as it is in most countries in the world, I should say, not everywhere, but it's not uncommon. And it's interesting that when we test with the intermodal, with the measures that integrated in this intermodal and infrastructure scenario, there is indeed an increase of the mode share of rail, of the inland waterways and river transport. Although, I mean, road keeps being the main mode, but there's more than a double of the modal share of rail, and the inland waterways also increase. Interestingly, in this global trend scenario, there is also an increase in the mode shares of rail and inland waterways. And in this scenario, there were no improvements per se to the infrastructure, but there are other things like, for instance, there's distance charges, there's carbon taxes, there's a slowdown and speed limits for road transport. And it's interesting to see that these other types of measures, regulatory and financial measures, they actually have an impact in the mode share, not so much as the intermodal scenario, but they also push these modes higher. There's also in this scenario, we'll see ahead, some change in commodities and in the trade partners in Argentina. Then, of course, in the combined scenario, you combine both these things of higher carbon taxes, distance charges, changes in trade patterns with the improvements in the infrastructure and for intermodal transport. And it's where you have a greater growth of both rail and the inland waterways. Although, as you can see, road is still by far the dominant transport mode. And it's still 75%, 3/4, it's still by road. But it's still, I would say, noticeably down from the situation that exists today. In terms of emissions, I was talking about the activity and what happens to the emissions in this case. And you can see the emissions increase. But I draw your attention that although the emissions increase inside Argentina, they do not increase as much as the demand. So, and this highlights what I said about this baseline scenario, which is not a static scenario. This is a scenario that already includes improvements to the efficiency of engines, some promotion of also intermodality. So it's not a static scenario, but because there's a big growth in demand, there's still a growth also in the emissions, and the measures that are set in place are not enough to decrease emissions. And what happens in the other scenarios when you compare it to this baseline? Interestingly, there is the intermodal scenario doesn't seem to have a big impact in emissions. And I'll explain why this happens later, but it doesn't seem to have a big impact. What does have a significant impact is the fleet renewal. The long distance, the heavy truck fleet renewal, this has a big impact in emissions. It's actually the scenario, except the combined, that brings emissions further down. Then it's also the electrification. And this only applies to urban freight, but per se, this also has a big impact. As you would expect, there's an increase in the e-commerce scenario because there's an even higher increase in activity. And in the combined scenario with all these trends, e-commerce, everything put together, it's where you actually achieve the best results, even though some of the trends are not positive. But when you combine all of these measures, even though some of the negative trends, it's where you get by far the best results and a substantial decrease in emissions. Now, up to now, I was talking about what happens inside Argentina, but I think it's also interesting to look what happens in the connections between Argentina and the world. And this is what we analyze in this graph. It's not the emissions inside in Argentina, but the emissions associated both with the imports and exports coming into and from Argentina. And one interesting result is that renewing the truck fleet still has an impact, even in these international trips. Electrification, because this is a very localized measure, doesn't have so much impact in these longer distance trips. E-commerce still increases, and now an interesting result. In the trends, there is actually a decrease in emissions here, which didn't happen inside Argentina, but in the relation with other countries and regions, there is a decrease in this scenario due to measures such as the slow steaming, such as the port fees, such as carbon taxes applied worldwide. It does have an impact in the overall transportation chain and international transportation chain. And again, the combined scenario is where it decreases more. Another interesting result associated with these exchanges, so not the transport inside Argentina itself, but with its partners, international partners, is to look what happens to the costs in all of these scenarios compared to the baseline. And this is, I think, very interesting that we see here. This result is that in this intermodal and infrastructure improvement scenario, there is a noticeable decrease in the operational costs of transport, especially when Mercosur countries and other South American countries, and these other South American countries is mostly Chile here. And you see here, this is the first part of the graph, there is this decrease in costs. When you look at the trend scenario, you look at an increase in costs, because I already mentioned the distance charges, the carbon taxes, etc. This increases the costs. And the same happens for the combined scenario, although less. And the reason why the costs decrease in the intermodal scenario, there's several reasons. One of them is because there's shorter routes, there's added capacity, and also because rail becomes available for trade both with Chile, with Brazil, and other neighboring countries. And the unit costs of rail are lower than, for instance, road, and this contributes to this decrease in costs. For travel times, it's a bit similar to what happens to the costs, but here what pushes the travel times down, when you look at trade with Mercosur, other Latin American countries, and other South American countries, is that you have more alternatives, you have more routes, you have shorter routes. Because you have better infrastructure, the speeds can also improve a bit, at least the commercial speed. And you also have, this is important, you have less friction at the borders, because in this scenario, you also assume that the travel times, the time of crossing borders will decrease. So all of this combined decreases the travel times. But okay, in the trend scenario, these global trends, when you're limiting the maximum speed, for instance, of road freight, and there, of course, this will increase the travel times. But in this combined scenario, even with these limitations, because you have the improvements brought by the improvements to the infrastructure, these other routes, etc., travel times still decrease when you combine everything. A note here also for the commodity mix and what happens, and this is in the baseline, but even in the baseline, not exactly we, this is values obtained from another department in the OECD that forecasts what are the trade future estimates of trade exchanges and for different types of commodities. And what we see here is that on oilseeds, and this is an important commodity for Argentina, there won't be significant changes, and this will still be an important part of the share of trade of Argentinian, while food products might decrease in the baseline, and more manufactured goods and electronics might increase. So there's some changes expected here. And of course, also coal, oil products, fossil fuels are also expected to decrease a bit. Okay, I'm already speaking for a while, but I think it's still important to go through some highlights per scenario. I'll try, and here going to the intermodal and this infrastructure improvements, and this explains a bit what that also happens with the emissions. What we see here is, although the mode share, you might think there's not drastic changes to the mode share, there's actually, the mode share of rail actually doubles, and the inland waterways mode shares also increase. And for this to happen in a context where you have increased overall demand, it's because the increases for these specific modes are very substantial. And at the same time, there are still increases for road transport, except, okay, in the intermodal, there is a slight decrease. It doesn't increase so fast, but there's still an increase even for road in this scenario. So you have to take in account still the immense effort. I mean, this might seem small, but this still requires this mode shift that we showed in this scenario, and even in the combined scenario, it's still a huge increase for what is currently being done, especially for rail. And you can see, because then we can analyze and see in the map where this increase comes from, and it comes from different areas, different geographies, but I would highlight here the international connections. And there's, because in this scenario, there's a new tunnel through the Alps through the Andes to connect Argentina and Chile. I think this is the North Patagonia corridor. So this increases, and there's an increase, noticeable increase to Chile through this corridor, also to the north, further north, and to Brazil too, actually, to Brazil via Uruguay, where it also increases. And there's also some domestic increase, but I would highlight these three corridors. Another thing very interesting that happens in this scenario is that the regions with which Argentina trades, of course, they are the same reasons, but the volume of trade changes, volume of trade and of transport activity associated with it changes a bit. So there's more tons traded with Mercosur countries, also with other South American countries. This is mostly Chile again, while for the other regions of the world, it stays flat or there's a slight decrease. So this is decrease of travel times, decrease of costs with other more options, transport options with the neighboring countries actually fosters an increase of trading with these closer partners geographically. While with the rest of the world, relatively speaking, there is a relative decline. Now, the scenario of the transition to gas. This is important because this is a scenario, like I mentioned, where emissions decrease the most, except the combined scenario. And you can see that specifically this transition in the scenario happens until 2030, and there's a significant decrease here. But because no other measures are taken up to 2050, and other sectors keep also increasing their emissions, by 2050, there's actually some of the gains are slightly reversed, but it's still a big cut in overall transport emissions. And also to noticeable that this also affects the international trips, especially to Mercosur, where road has a bigger, of course, a bigger weight, but in trade with other regions, because the access to ports always has a strong road component in Argentina, it will also decrease the emissions even in these longer distance travels. An important caveat to this scenario, because that's why we named it fleet renewal and not just a transition to gas. It's because when you see where most of the gains from this scenario come from, they come from the fleet renewal, from this transition to gas as a source, as a fuel source. But the thing is, when we compare, and John already alluded to this a bit, when we compare the carbon intensity of trucks nowadays in Argentina with what happens in Germany, and we could put here US numbers, for instance, you can see that the values in Argentina are much higher, and part of this has to do with the old age of the fleet, of the truck fleet. And so when you see, even in 2030, when you compare what is the expected carbon intensity of trucks in Germany with what we are estimating the gas, this new gas fleet in Argentina, we see that, yes, the gas fleet in Argentina, when you consider tank to wheel and not the full wheel to well emissions, but when you just compare the transport component of emissions itself, you can see, yes, it's a bit better, but it's just a 15% difference. So most of this decrease is actually associated with the renewal of the fleet. And I'll also point here another thing, which also has to do with the occupancy, the utilization of available capacity in Argentina. And one of the things we noticed is that compared to the US and Europe, where it depends, but around 20% of the vehicle kilometers are run empty. And the values we had several exchanges with Argentina about this, but the value that is used is a 50% empty running, 50% of vehicle kilometers. And this is very high. And this is much higher than what happens in Europe and the US. And even though Argentina, for instance, compared to Europe, has actually measures to have higher capacity vehicles, but then there's big losses because the available capacity, it's not used to the utmost. The electrification scenario is very straightforward. And here the main thing to highlight is that emissions of urban freight account for more than 20% of total freight emissions, transport freight emissions. So this is a sizable component of the emissions in Argentina and actually around the world. So cutting the emissions, and wherever we have technologies that allows us to cut these emissions. So this is, I would say, a very straightforward policy to cut emissions. Then the scenario with e-commerce, the point here to highlight is that indeed this will drive demand up, particularly on the urban level, but not only at the urban level, also the longer distance, at the longer distance, this will also drive demand for transport. But and so if policies are not set in place in this scenario, emissions are actually going to grow above the baseline. Then looking at the global trends, the global trend scenario, we can see that there's actually, when you look at the emissions at the and the trade with of Argentina with different regions of the world, it's interesting that because there is more commerce, more activity with Mercosur countries, the emissions of transport associated with them increases. But for all other regions where where like shipping, especially shipping, is one of the main modes used. And because in this scenario, you have measures, global measures that bring emissions down for this long distance trade, the emissions actually decrease for the rest of the regions. Also to point that in this scenario, there's a big decrease in, compared to the baseline, there's even a further increase in coal and petroleum products, while again, compared to the baseline, food products increase, and most other commodities increased compared to the baseline, but especially these food products. In the combined scenario, you can see here what are the emissions we estimate for 2015, closer to the Argentinian also estimates. And then we see that in 2030, there's already a big decrease that is capped in 2050. So this scenario cuts emissions by more than half compared to 2015, cuts emissions for more than half. And it cuts it by around 60% when compared to the baseline. So combining all of these measures and all of these policies, even taking into account that there are things like e-commerce that are considered in this scenario, but still there is a significant drop in emissions here. And in this scenario, like for the intermodal scenario, there is also an increase in rail, actually it's even higher, the increase in rail and inland waterways along the corridors I already mentioned for the intermodal scenario. But in this case, just to highlight that also road that appears in this map, also for road, there's also increases in activity actually in this scenario, particularly international activity. And there's also a domestic increase, for instance, for rail in this scenario. It's not just in the international corridors, but for instance, in the connections between Buenos Aires to Tucumán, to Mendoza, to Bahia Blanca, or to Cordoba, there's also an increase in use of rail in this scenario. And now to wrap this up, my colleagues haven't said anything, so I suppose my time is good still. So just to wrap up with some main insights. So the first step here, I mean, I think it was listening to these results and looking at them. The first step from a decarbonization point of view, it's the fleet renewal. It's the fleet renewal both for urban and non-urban operations type. So this is the first most important thing that can be done. The second, we put here foster intermodality, but here intermodality will only bring about a decrease in emissions if it really brings about the modal shift, like what happens in the combined scenario, and not only by increasing the overall activity of transport. Because if you just increase the activity of transport, this per se will not decrease emissions. What you can say is, okay, at least if we didn't add this improvement into intermodality, the increase will be even higher than it would be if it was not using rail or inland waterways. And a third, I think, important message is that you really need to combine a set of measures, regulatory measures, governance of the sectors, improvements to infrastructure, at the city level, at the provincial level, national level, and even international level. So all of this is required to achieve the results that we show in these scenarios. And I have to highlight here a couple of takeaways, important takeaways. First, related with this road freight and the vehicles and technologies used in road freight, and underlying that besides the technology itself and the fleet renewal itself, one of the things that we really were impressed with is this, and there's structural reasons that why this happens in Argentina, but this issue that 50% of the vehicle kilometers done by road are assumed to be empty trips. Okay, this is really an issue that needs to, first, I think more data collection in the ground has to be made to be sure that this is actually the fact. So I think it would be worthwhile to check this and to recheck this. And second, to try to set up in policies, and even this might have even to do with the way the structure is organized in Argentina, but it would be really important to, besides renewing the fleet, also tackling this issue and trying to decrease the number of these empty runnings. Another important takeaway that I'll make here, I think it's a second and very important takeaway, has to do with this infrastructure and improvements to intermodality and cross-border traffic. And what we see in our model is that if you, like the results show, per se, this will not be a huge contribute to decarbonization per se, but it will, combined with other measures, it will contribute to decarbonization, and it will allow to activity while not increasing emissions compared to the baseline. And I think most importantly, it does seem, according at least to our results, it does seem to foster the trade between regions or between countries in Mercosur. I think
Hi,
this is a
Francisco.
very
Sorry.
interesting,
2 minutes,
very
please.
interesting results. Yeah, and okay, this is the main takeaway I want to conclude it here, is that transport here can also, of course, not per se, but transport can play a role in further integrating the economy of the countries in the region and doing it in a sustainable way. Brief mention to the theme, you already see the three of us, me, myself, John, Joshua, but I would also like to allude to Luis Martinez, which was critical in the quantitative work. And he was the one that originally developed the model and had a critical role in adapting the model for this work. And also Pablo Vazano, which has been in this project since day one, since the fact-finding mission. And he was very, very relevant, especially in the part of updating the network and the upgrades to the network in this infrastructure scenario. He played a critical role. And thank you very much for your time.
Muchas gracias, Francisco. Muchas gracias, John, por su tiempo, por su intervención. John, disculpa, ¿podrías aplicar?
I'm sorry.
Muchas gracias de nuevo por...
Thank you for your time. We do have one question from the audience. As regards the data of this modeling, we'll ask these two questions and then we'll go to a short break. Francisco and then John may supplement this. Could you please explain what do you refer with the idle or vacuum space, or where does this data 50% of empty running trips are done in an idle way or in the vacuum?
This is a critical piece of information. And if you look at by the way, in the publication itself, the final part of the publication has a part dedicated to references and data source and bibliography. So I invite you all to look at that. And some of the more critical data sources that we are used are actually referenced in the publication in numbers. So you can see those. And then you can see in the end all the data sources we used. So for this particular piece of data, we used the information that was available in the extensive work the Department of National Cargo in Argentina. This is part this is the department that's part of the Argentinian Transport Ministry. I'll say it in Spanish. Is the Dirección Nacional de Planificación de Transporte.
The National Direction of Planning of Freight Transport and Logistics.
2000, the previous decade, they have collecting data, crossing data from different sources, even financial sources, etc. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you, Francisco.
Okay. It was from this model that we took the 50% value. After that, there's other two things, which we not only saw the value in the model, but then we asked our Argentinian counterparts, is this real? Is this the value that you use? Don't you think it's too much, etc.? And they did discuss, this is the value that we use. And part of this, I think, has to do with the structure of trade in Argentina, because there's a lot of trade that goes from the interland regions, from the regions inside the country that produce grain, produce food products. And then this cargo goes to the ports, is exported, and then these trucks go back empty. And the trucks that bring the manufactured products that arrive and the imports are different trucks. And then they return empty to the port. So I think this is a bit what's happening in Argentina right now, but this is definitely an area. And that's why I say it's a bit of a surprising result in some ways. And I say this is an information that definitely needs to be further explored. And I would say this is not a direct data point, but it's also an indirect data point, is that we had the TKM from Argentina. What I mean by TKM, we had the total volume of transport from Argentina, and we also had estimates for the emissions. And by crossing these two data sources, you can get the carbon intensity. And what we noticed was that the carbon intensity in Argentina, for instance, when you compare to Germany, the US, and other countries, was much higher. Even though the trucks in Argentina, in average, are actually bigger trucks, so they can carry more load at a time. So this would lead you to think that they would be actually a bit lower. And they are much higher. Yes, because the fleet is older, that's part of the reason, but that's not just it. Part of the reason why they are higher, it's also this empty running.
Muchas gracias, Francisco, por esa respuesta.
Thank you, Francisco, for your answer. John doesn't need to add anything else. There's a second question from the audience related to our sources. Where do we get the emission factor of trucks in grams of CO2 tons kilometer for long distance in Argentina?
And if you look at the publication, there's actually a debate, and there's one of the slides is specifically dedicated to this. And I can tell him that for this truck, so the values we had for Momo that John alluded were not very correct. And so we looked at the total emissions, and there is a fleet report. There's a Reporte de Flotas in Argentina from 2018 or 19, but you can see that it's in the document, in the references there. Yeah. And we also use the values for activity from our model and comparing to the national cargo model of Argentina that also exists. And by crossing the value of these emissions with the value of the activity crossing the boat, we could reach this value of carbon emissions, of carbon intensity, I mean.
Perfecto. Muchas gracias, Francisco.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Francisco. We have some other questions. However, because of the time and the timing of the session.
A nosotros por correo.
I believe
Estamos
it's better
felices de-
if you send these questions, email these questions to us so that we can answer all those questions. Moreover, the reports that we are referring to can be found online. And after all of these reports have been verified with the sources, we will be able to answer any questions that you will have in the upcoming days. Thank you very much. Gustavo, just one thing before we close. Joshua, I would like to thank everyone, all the team. I wanted to thank the team, Francisco. I will address the audience later on, but I would like to thank Francisco because of for their report and their work, because our debate will address something else. So I wanted to seize these 2 seconds to thank you personally. Thank you, Marcos, and all the team on this report. And I would also like to mention that all the opinions and the observations of this report can be improved if the data is not correct. And if there is data to be improved, we will work on the improvement of all this information. If in bulk there's something that we can improve, we will do that undoubtedly. So thank you. I just wanted to show our appreciation. If you have any question, please send us all your doubts and we will reinforce and improve all the information if we missed something too. Thank you. Thank you, Gustavo, for your intervention and your contribution. So we will write all the emails for John Pritchard and myself, in case you have any questions. So we'll now go to our coffee break until 4 p.m. Europe time, 11 a.m. Buenos Aires time. We'll meet soon. Thank you.
A todos de nuevo. Buenos días para los que están del otro lado
Good
del chat.
morning and good afternoon for those of you who are at the other side of the ocean.
Solo verificar que estén todos nuestros.
I would like to verify that all our panel members are present.
Perfecto.
Okay, perfect.
Entonces, bienvenidos a todos.
Welcome, everyone.
Y bienvenidas a todos y todas a esta segunda parte.
Welcome to this second section of our event.
Una sesión sobre implementación.
We'll have a session on implementation and feasibility of public policies of decarbonization in Latin America and the Caribbean. We'll have representatives of Argentina and Brazil, Chile, and Colombia. That is the alphabetical order. The representatives will present for 5 minutes about the results that we have just presented. And at the end, we will have interactions with the audience through questions and answers. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A tool available in Zoom. So I'll introduce our panelists. For Argentina, we'll have Gustavo Rinaldi. You have heard him. He's the director of environmental impact within the Argentinian Transport Ministry, Environmental Ministry. From Brazil, we have Larissa Morim Busan, Undersecretary of Sustainability of the Infrastructure Ministry of Brazil. Then from Chile, Mrs. Ana Pezzo, coordinator of the transport group through the Urban Logistic Development Program of Transport and Telecommunication in Chile. And finally, from Colombia, Juan David Roldan, coordinator of environmental affairs and sustainable development in the Transport Ministry of Colombia. We would like to thank you all thank all the panelists for having accepted being part of this webinar. Without further ado, Gustavo, you have the floor. Thank you, Joshua, and thank you, our fellow panel members, Juan David, Larissa, and then Ana from Chile. I can see her now. I will be very brief because the main topic of this panel is to be able to listen to all the colleagues from the region, since of course we'll have a space, a specific space for Argentina. So I will be very brief. And I will just mention 2 or 3 remarks at the regional level on how we can address the decarbonization of the transport at the regional level with a view from the developing countries and the emerging countries perspective in Latin America and the Caribbean, where there are specificities in our countries, specific features of our countries. We do have different situations in every country, and this may mean that there are some disadvantages, and at some moments we may have some more complex challenges. But I believe it's important to set ourselves in the road of decarbonization with a regional perspective, where we can think about decarbonization of the transport and electromobility and the different policies of decarbonization or emissions reductions. Not just in terms of electric mobility. Francisco mentioned a report which sets different axes: intermobility, active mobility. Juan David will most likely mention what Colombia is doing on this regard. There's a lot to do from the regional perspective and also in the implementation at the local level, because the truth is that there's a lot to do at the municipal level, at the city level, in the last mile approach, logistics, packaging. I can see Diego Mondillan from Argentine mailing company Correo Argentino, and they are really focused on specific policies on packaging. There is a lot to do on that regard. And taking into account that the transport decarbonization in terms of electric mobility or active mobility policies, intermodality, and the different policies that we will implement should be considered in a systemic way, in such a way that we just not think in the reduction of emissions, but also for the transport sector to think how we can keep our operations in this transition, with a fair transition, with the unions, with all the stakeholders that are involved in the transport system, within the system, because the truth is that we cannot think of transition policies without taking into account the possibility of these transition policies like electric mobility and natural gas policies. All of these policies should incorporate the industrial sector, and they should be empowered at the same time. There is a very close relation between transport policy and industrial development policies. On the one hand, because transport moves around the goods, and also this entails a great possibility for the auto industry, at least in Argentina, Brazil, in Mexico, all members of ITF, we have a burgeoning auto industry, car industry, and we should take into account all the challenges of the industry. Our challenge in Argentina is more complex to move to a zero emissions situation, and also taking in the change of the car industry in terms of vehicles, of course. This is something that makes us think specifically about, together with Brazil and Mexico, all the countries where the car industry is relevant. Also with other countries of the region, our customers, if we develop our car industry in our country with installed capacity, we should be able to sell those products to Chile, Colombia, Uruguay, vehicles of zero emissions that are more affordable than the ones that might be bought in China or other countries, because the market will be more regional and closer to where they are located. And of course, Argentina has wonderful natural resources, renewable natural resources, not just gases, but there are many renewable resources that we should harness. Colombia, I believe that will address hydrogen. I believe Chile and Argentina will do so too. So we are assessing the potential in the region to produce this kind of fuel, to produce a cleaner fuel in the transition to zero emissions vehicles, especially for those areas of more difficult abatement. I believe hydrogen will be used in this line. So I said I wanted to be brief. We can continue this conversation later on. That is my observation. Two main points: the regional integration and the cross-cutting integration in the close work with other sectors, with social sectors, that should be taken into account on how this transition to a cleaner transport improves the livelihood of our fellow country people, not just in terms of transport, but also this should be a transition that takes into account the ways of life of people, how people go to school, how they commute. Of course, we should take transport into account in this regard. There's a lot to think about in that sense to improve the way we live and our quality of life, and of course, the access to other essential rights, education, work. And last but not least, I promise, think we should consider adaptation. We are thinking about decarbonization, but of course we cannot lose sight of, while we are decarbonizing, we should adapt, of course, the transport system. We are witnessing the severe consequences of climate change, and the transport sector continues to move people and goods within this complex scenario, which will become more complex, most likely in the upcoming years. So I would like to, that is why I like to mention this. Decarbonization policies will improve the economy as a whole, but we should not lose sight how transport should adapt. Because according to the situation, if there is overflows from rivers or if there are fires, we should protect people. So I'm eager to listen to other colleagues from the region. So thank you for your invitation and all the work from ITF with all the donors and with all other stakeholders that were part of this initiative. Thank you.
Thank you, Gustavo. Without further ado, let me give the floor to Ms. Undersecretary Larissa Amorim dos Santos.
Thank you, Joshua. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon to my colleagues from Europe. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. Thanks for the invitation. I would like to congratulate my fellow speakers, Gustavo Rinaldi, Ana Peso, and Juan Roldan. The Ministry of Infrastructure has as premise to provide integrated and reliable infrastructure for safe and efficient mobility of people and goods. The issue of sustainability is a guideline for this ministry. We are taking into account all issues related to climate change. Sustainable infrastructure is recognized as an essential basis for achieving inclusive and sustainable growth, meeting the Sustainable Development Goals and the goals of the Paris Agreement is the commitment of the Brazilian government, whose strategies are present in our sectorial policies in line with the Ministry Sustainability Guidelines. In accordance with international guidelines, the Ministry of Infrastructure constantly seeks to improve the sustainable management of its enterprise and access, striving to incorporate the best practices of social environmental management, climate and ESG agenda in the planning, implementation, and expansion and operation phases of the federal transport infrastructure. To guide these actions, the sustainability guidelines of ministry were published, a strategic and political document, which is the main reference for the execution of the actions of the ministry and its entities linked to the sustainability teams. The guidelines cover 5 thematic areas. The first one is planning and governance. Then we have climate change, then projects, studies, and research. I'm sorry, I have a problem with my internet. I think we are good again. Okay. I'm gonna start again about the guidelines. We have guidelines cover 5 thematic areas, which are planning and governance, climate change, projects, studies and research, environmental licensing, and territorial management. The operational document of these guidelines is the Sustainability Agenda, revised every 4 years, which aims to foster synergy and integration of the efforts spent by the various actors in the sector, reflecting an instrument capable of marking actions that are intended to be carried out during the period of each presidential administration. We understand that the world needs to increase investments in a sustainable infrastructure to address large deficits in infrastructure services, especially in emerging markets and developing countries, respond to ongoing structural change, and accelerate the replacement of aged and polluting infrastructure. In this direction, we have reached a cooperation agreement with a German cooperation agency in Brazil, GIZ, and with the Climate Bonds Initiative, CBI, entities with international recognition, which have helped us in structuring our projects and mapping environmental and climate risks. We are incorporating these studies and analysis in planning and execution of these projects because we know pragmatically that in the near future, all financial flows will be linked to environmental and climatic standards. We need to combine our ability to engineer with the interest of investors, and it is essential to adapt and mitigate climate risk for the benefit of society and gain access to other forms of financing, such as green bonds, green loans, by entering with committed in this green market. The commitment of our ministry is to support Brazilian government's efforts to deliver sustainable infrastructure, promoting a modal shift to low-carbon transport systems. The requirements in transport efficient and the infrastructure quality are central to countries' competitiveness and reductions of emissions from the sector. We know that there is an improvement in this direction Substantial investments will be needed, especially from alternative and sustainable sources. Infrastructure planning should integrate principles of sustainability and climate risk. When building more resilient assets, the lower impact of climate-related events in relation to their durability, with the occurrence of extreme events on the reduction of interruptions of services provided, avoiding economic losses with the proper maintenance of these enterprises. The Ministry of Infrastructure has established the Integrated Transport Planning, PIT, which aims to establish a systemic and intermodal transport planning logic. The PIT is composed at a strategic level of the National Logistic Plan, NLP, that identifies through indicators the needs and opportunities present and future of offering capacity of transport subsystems, in addition to tracing prospects for the movement of people and goods, and identifying a series of transport infrastructure with high national relevance, considering the various possible scenarios in the planning horizon. All these elements contribute to a more sustainable and resilient transportation and logistics sector, which leads to lower GIG emissions, greater safety and efficiency. According to the scenario simulated in the National Logistic Plan, with projects already underway, it is observed that results point to a more balancing transport matrix with great participation of large capacity modes, such as railroads and waterways, and consequently with lower cost and more environmentally sustainable. For the road sector, the challenge is greater, but there are ways to minimize the environmental impact through sustainable practices, such as the use of less polluting fuels, prioritization of vehicles with clean technology, and fleet renewal. For air transport, the ministry has established a clear vision for its decarbonization. Inventory and monitoring emissions reduction targets align with the Paris Agreement and prospecting new actions from several aspects. The first aspect refers to the importance of the actions to reduce the impact of aviation on climate change and the need to take long-term policies that provide stability to the airline sector. The second,
Secretary, 1 minute, please.
Okay, I'm gonna finish. The second aspect is the development of basket of measures to mitigate the impact of civil aviation on climate change, composed of operational and improvements, technological improvements, investments in infrastructure, fostering the adoption of more sustainable fuels and measures. The alignment between domestic actions to reduce or offset of aviation GIG emissions and the international commitments made by Brazil. In addition, the consideration of the strategic importance of sustainable aviation fuels is the process for stabilization GIG emissions by the air sector, are important premises that have been considered. Brazil is on track to decarbonize its transportation infrastructure sector, but there are still opportunities for improvements for this transformation be even more sustainable. The integration of sustainability in the planning of transport infrastructure, the integration of climate risk, and the mobilization of investment for sustainable infrastructure are an important step in this direction. Thank you, Josh. I'm sorry for the time. And thank you all.
Thank you, Madam Undersecretary. Ahora me permito darle...
I will now give the floor to Ms. Ana Peso from the Ministry of Transport and Telecommunications from Chile. Hello, good day to you all. Thank you to the ITF for inviting me. This is something that is really passionate for me. It has made us share our opinions throughout the region, thinking about what are the best practices for our different nations and regions within the decarbonization arena. Why am I talking about the different sectors or regions? Well, because we always look at this from the transport perspective, which is what summons us. Generally, we're talking about 20-25% of contribution to CO2 emissions in Latin America. But the other 75% also depends on what we do as human beings, as people who trade and live. So it is logical for us governments to have more comprehensive, holistic visions with regards to what the decarbonization process means for our countries, for our economies, and mostly on each and every one of us as inhabitants, because this entails many changes, like Gustavo said, the ways we go to school, the way we move around the cities, the way we purchase, and the way we buy food. And this is something that is seen mostly in Argentina because of the way they handle the agricultural production that they have. So these regional incentives and activities show that this is not just a matter of choosing to reduce emissions, but choosing a new way towards development. And that is our slogan, our mantra, and hopefully it will be so for many years to come. We are a relatively small country. We account for 0.25% of emissions by 2016. But still, we have addressed this issue seriously. We have shown great government commitment. We have always tried to include the private sector because unfortunately without them, the government would have no execution power. And this has been reflected in two large strategies that I would like to mention because they actually respond to these guidelines to action, like Francisco mentioned in his presentation. These are guidelines or calls to action so that we can create policies and then implement them. In our country, last year we have launched the hydrogen generation strategy, which means that us as a country, we will be one of the green hydrogen producers and exporters in the future towards 2040. Also, considering the hydrogen production potential that we have as a country, given the characteristics and the natural resources that we have, our deserts in the north, and the constant winds that we have in the south, then they position us as generators and exporters, but also that gives us the possibility to develop technologies that domestically use this national hydrogen production. So this strategy, apart from production, addresses things like capacity building and knowledge transfer, because we need to, as a nation, we need to train ourselves on how to produce and use this technology. There's also a lot of hard work being done on investment and job creation. We will have to build plants, hydrogen plants, and build different chains of processes. We also deal with territorial planning, and this is something that will affect the way in which we decarbonize logistic pathways. Territorial planning goes hand in hand with making intermodality feasible, of creating supply lines for densely populated areas without forgetting about rural areas or remote areas or areas that are farther away from cities. And particularly now with COVID, I think that logistic chains are now stressed and are focused on trying to find ways to deliver medical supplies in such an emergency context. I will stop here when it comes to hydrogen strategy, but at COP26, we will be submitting the long-term climate strategy of Chile. This is a very global comprehensive strategy that deals with not only transport issues, but also natural resources preservation. Also, we talk about goals in terms of home buildings and residential creation, carbon retirement, water basins protection, and many other things that are not, although are not directly linked to transport, they will create a scenario that will be a catalyst for transport decarbonization policies. And I go back now to the call to action or the guideline to action, which made a lot of sense when I saw the results that you showed. In both strategies, the national strategies, transport has an important role toward 2030. We are thinking about restricting the circulation of traditional light and heavy vehicles. These transitions have a considerable costs for economy, and us as a ministry, as a government, we need to try to have these transition costs not affect a particular sector, but that can eventually be controlled and shared by all the beneficiaries. There are many international discussions, whether it should be via subsidies or taxes or via some other sort of incentives for use. Well, for the moment, we're not working on those things, but we're trying to foster the enablers of that technology. And that's why I will mention two things that personally we're working on at the ministry, that is incentives to electromobility from public-private cooperation. We have been trying to get to join the user experience with data generation. This is something that was mentioned in the previous session's presentation. Nationally speaking, we don't have precise, clear information on, for example, what is the effective occupancy of our transport capacity per truck. We know that it is about 20 to 30% of idle capacity when it comes to the kilometers of road transport. But if we want to create policies and quantify policies and create investments, we need precise information. So these electromobility experiences that we are fostering are very linked to the available information. We have just entered into a project that is called electrologistics, where in cooperation with private companies, vehicle importers, municipalities, you have just 1 minute left. Yes, I'm closing. Municipalities and other actors, we invited them to test for free one truck that had electromobility features, and they committed to use the truck and then made the information available to us, which is available online at the moment. We just wanted to have information available so that people who are interested in these topics can do commercial or business assessments. We understand that nowadays the cost of buying a truck, whether electrical or hydrogen powered truck, is way above the cost of a traditional truck. And we need to be aware of it as a ministry. And we need to find a way to facilitate public-private investments that are aware of what the adoption curves will be and what are the curves gonna be that affect their profit. Thank you very much, and I'm open to your questions.
Thank you, Mrs. Ana Peso. I will give the floor to Juan David Roldan. Thank you. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. First of all, I would like to thank ITF for this invitation. There are several things that I will pick up from the other panelists and from the things that were mentioned by ITF. In the exercise for decarbonizing the transport, this should be regional because the experience of each country is very special. And what we have done in the transport sector in Colombia, our Minister Hood was holding a conversation, and it was funny. She said that this is a game of cooperation among everyone. When I say I need 1,000 and the other person gives 1,000, then we keep needing more and more. So the development of this project in the region is very interesting because we are sharing experiences, and there are several experiences that can be shared here. And as Francisco said, for us, it's very interesting in the transport sector in Colombia. One of the things that we have understood is that we work on this project with 3 projects to consolidate intermodality. It's not just freight transport, urban transport, which accounts for 90% in Colombia. 90% of the freight is moved via trucks. So this is a proposal that we have set forth. So the waterway of Magdalena River, which is the main river that goes from the center to the Caribbean coast and shows potential for giant and huge freight. So we're moving forward with a public-private alliance that can guarantee the transport, the waterway transport 24/7. This will be very important, but right next to this, for those of you who know Colombia, the Magdalena Valley will have a railway project so that we should not rely solely on waterway transport. So this will make freight transport more efficient and more sustainable. There's an area here that facilitates freight transport via trucks through the mountains with some geographical difficulties that we have here in Colombia. So the idea is to have all of these elements combined, not just in terms of transport, but of logistics aspect. So this is the initial front, to consolidate the intermodality in the country. The second front is the energy transition that was mentioned by Ana. This is a quite practical exercise because transport in Colombia has a specific emission features. This is the third sector. Transport is the third sector that accounts for emission. And at the international level, the transport sector is quite important. But in terms of energy, if we consume 44% of the energy production in the country, and 90% of our hydrocarbons. So when we analyze this, the energy transition will be key. If we do not act now, by 2050, there will be a demand uptake because there will be some other sectors that are working in energy transition, and the transport sector must do its part. So we should also debate, at least in the Colombian case, it is very important that the debate is not just in terms of technology. It's not just a matter of technological and improvements that are more efficient. We know that as long as we renew the car vehicle, if we move from one type of vehicle to other that are more efficient, will be a wonderful change. But this front of work, this is an exercise. It's not just a technological exercise, but a social exercise, because we realize that 88% of the goods transported in the country are done by companies, by owners of freight transport companies. And when we tell the drivers that they need to change the trucks that they are driving, the answer that they give us is just that I won't change this. These are my goods, and this is not something that I'm going to change. This is a sector that is committed to the exercises, but from the national government, we must understand that there is actually a social problem. And that is what we have seen in the transport sector in Colombia. So we do have a modernization program from the national government, and all the exercises that we have conducted throughout all these years, with the entry of the vehicles, there is an additional fee to finance the funds. And that fund for modernization is to generate all the financial incentives. So that is not just something of demanding these changes from the companies, but also providing some acknowledgement when they actually implement these changes. So this is a social problem because we do know what the technologies are. We have pilot programs, but we need to convince all of the stakeholders and trying to make them understand that there are social needs and there are vulnerabilities and many things at stake. And the third front is the sustainable mobility aspect, how to make this a massive project, how to move passengers from Bogota and through the Medellin, to Medellin, which is the second largest city, and also the connectivity within the region with the capital city. And of course, this is one of the major improvements, and I truly believe that electric mobility should and is the solution. In the Electric Mobility Act in Colombia, and as a precedent, this law was enacted. So that is when this national strategy stems from. And together with all these plans, what we see, it's a battery of incentives, of technical regulations and financial regulations in terms of technomechanical reductions in cars. We have preferential parking lots and incentives to freight infrastructure, of course, incentives to transport systems. The country co-funds transport companies to renew the fleet. So a major aspect that I would like to mention, thank you. Because of the intersectionality of this project, we are working with the Environment Ministry, with the Energy Ministry, with the Trade Ministry, with the mining unit that provides, of course, all the energy, and of course, the Ministry of Transport. So all of these questions show that there is incentive, there is willingness, but of course, this should be an institutional work within the country. So we are starting this project from Colombia with different participation with international funds, where we can meet and gather with all the different countries to have a common front, which will help us, because there is a gap between the gap of a vehicle and a new technology and the cost of old technologies. For instance, importing them from one country will entail a huge cost, but if we have a common front as a region, we can implement the technological standards and the rest. And of course, that is why I believe this kind of spaces are very important in order to present the common front, so that at international level, everyone can realize that Latin America has all the chances and the characteristics of becoming the leader. And despite the vulnerability that we have in facing climate change, we are making huge strides. And that is, I believe, we should exchange all the measures and experiences to see what works in one area and to share, again, all of these experiences to be able to implement them. That is quite valuable. Those are the three main fronts that I wanted to mention for this problem that we are facing in the different countries of the region. So we'll move ahead with this commitment and the leadership that our countries have, not just at the regional level, but at the international level. Thank you. Thank you, Juan David. Unfortunately, because of the time. Okay, Joshua, you are quite strict with all the timing. Okay, the next step that you're going to take is just to mute us. Just a final reflection, a final comment. Because sometimes we don't have this kind of opportunities of having this sort of conversation. I believe that we still have one topic that we need to address is to implement energy efficiency measures. We talked about transition and the change of vehicles, but today in the use of fossil fuel, each country has specific programs. There's one in Brazil, and of course in Colombia. We are all working for the cargo companies to implement energy efficiency measures of eco-driving to make this transition easier in order to have this progressive change. Because once we have electric mobility and hydrogen mobility, we'll need to continue being efficient in terms of energy use and energy consumption. So this is quite interesting because for this sector, energy efficiency does not has consequences, of course, in the environmental aspect and emissions reduction, but also it has consequences in the sector in terms of costs that can be implemented today. So that is something that we needed to consider within the region. Of course, there are many more things to discuss. I believe that ITF should continue incentivizing this sort of debates and spaces. So let's continue. Let's go ahead. It's a pleasure. It's been a pleasure being here with you. And hopefully we'll meet again soon in person in either country, in all of our countries. Sorry, Joshua, for taking up these 2 minutes. Thank you.
No worries, Gustavo. Thank you for your intervention. I would also like to give the opportunity to the remaining speakers. I will give a minute to each of you. So unfortunately, I will let you know at 30 seconds so that you can stick to the minute that I will give you. Perhaps Secretary Amorim dos Santos can begin to give us final conclusion.
Amazing to hear my colleagues from America Latina because we could see that we have the same problems, right? And the same needs. It was very important to me to hear from Gustavo and from Diego, from Juan, that we need to think in a regional scale because in Brazil we have a largest territory. So it's very difficult to planning and in small scales. And all we do here in our sector is to study and planning for regional scale.
30 seconds,
so
please.
I believe that we need to talk more and
Se nos cayó Larissa, ¿no?
Sí, creo que hubo problemas de conexión. De todas maneras,
I think
resalto.
Larissa is having connection issues, but in any case, I would like to highlight the need for dialogue, as the Deputy Secretary said. Anna, you have the floor. Thank you, Joshua. I just wanted to highlight the importance of collaboration and cooperation. We can learn a lot from each other. It is important that ITF prepares these documents where you give us guidelines and methodologies and practices that us as a government in this region, we need to take into consideration. And I think also that it's important to share, and hopefully in the near future we'll be able to do so, to share the relevance of having homogeneous data. In many of these forums, we ask, how do you measure this? How do you calculate certain indicators? But I think it's important that at least in Latin America, we can speak the same language. When we say a figure, we can all understand what we're talking about. And better yet, it'd be great to have global, regional statistics so that we can then make decisions when it comes to freight and people transport, so that we can have more efficient economies. Thank you for your final words and comments. Ana, Juan David, you have the floor. I just want to add to what my colleague said, and I agree with what Ana said. We have to have a monitoring effort to reduce emissions jointly. That is a huge challenge, and in line with what our Brazilian colleagues said, in order to do so, we will need to be measuring things. If we don't measure, we can't see and act upon things, and we cannot create public policies. So I would like to get together with all these ideas so that we can have a regional approach and then achieve the region's ambition in terms of energy transition and transport decarbonization. Because as Gustavo said, if we achieve this, our transport will not only be more sustainable, but also more efficient and cost efficient, which at the end of the day is one of the things our economies need to reactivate and grow in general. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Roland. Thank you all our panel members for such relevant comments that enrich and nurture our work. And thank you for bearing with me as a moderator. I will now give the floor to my colleague, John Pritchard, who will be the moderator of the second half of this session. Thank you. Thank you. I would like to welcome you to the final half of the session. We will have a national panel where we will talk about the challenges of implementing decarbonization policies focused again in Argentina. I would like to welcome different people from Argentina. Guido Sanchez, the manager of institutional relations of Correo Argentino. We have Diego Monjan, who is the Innovation and Technological Director. From Iveco Argentina, we have Francisco Sosaro, Commercial Director. And finally, we will receive Jorge Armendáriz, the Secretary of Transport and Transportation of the province of San Juan. Let me check if every one of them is here so that we can then quickly give the floor to Mr. Guido Sanchez from Trenes Argentinos. Can you hear me? Can you see me? Yes, perfect. You have the floor. I'm generally the institutional relations manager of ADIF, that is railway infrastructure, but I will be talking about the Argentine railway system. We have a mother company called Ferrocarriles Argentinos, FASE, and from then we have ADIF, the Railway Infrastructure Administrator, SOCE, as well for passenger trains, and Belgrano Cargas, which is the railway state-run operator for freight. So I will very briefly describe the programs that we have ongoing in terms of sustainability or decarbonization in the rail transport mode, but not only related to ADIF per se. generally speaking, the actions implemented by these entities are within the framework of complying with the Sustainable Development Goals. For example, goal number 3, ensuring a healthy life for all ages. 5, to achieve equality, gender equality, and to empower all women and girls. Number 7, to ensure the access to affordable, safe, and sustainable energy for all. 9, mostly, because we build resilient infrastructure and we promote inclusive work. 11, to achieve safe, secure, resilient, sustainable settlements. 12, to have sustainable production, and 13, to adopt urgent measures to fight climate change. And also number 15, I would try to move forward because I'm running out of time, but particularly within objective and the goal number 9, as for ADIF, goal 9.1 is to develop sustainable, reliable, quality infrastructures, including regional and cross-border infrastructures. In this regard, the specific goal, what we set out to do is to promote the interconnection of railway systems and intermodality with other transport modes that are not only railways, to achieve a territorial integration and to favor the reduction of vehicles and road transit so that traffic jams can be reduced, and also sound and CO2 pollution can be reduced, also creating or saving time when traveling. A flagship work and effort of this vision of the railway system, we have created the Circunvalar Santa Fe road and work, which is related on the one hand with port transport. So what we expect is to carry out a work that reduces the frequency of railway traffic in an urban area. Nowadays, we have trains with 45 wagons, and we want to bring that down to 80, so to 8 to 10 trains with 60 or 6 to 100 wagons. This railroad transit takes 10 hours so far, and we want to cut that down to 2.5 hours. We are also suggesting to promote the development of and the construction and generation of electric trains by expanding new railway operations in the Tigre and Suarez branches of the railway so as to replace diesel-powered trains with electric trains. These are things that will be beginning soon, promoting modal transport with the renewal and the creation of new railway infrastructure. We have already optimized transportation by revitalizing the surrounding areas of each train station. We not only focus on improving the railway infrastructure per se, but also we want to focus on the surrounding areas of the stations because we're considering intermodality. So therefore, we are building many places to store bicycles in the stations so that we can promote bicycle transportation and to mix it with trains. I just have 1 minute left. Okay, I'll sum up. So we're fostering the bicycle transit and traffic, and we're projecting to build solar farms so that we can cut down on electric consumption for passenger railway transport. We're also implementing a corporate program for energy transition. I'm trying to move forward and trying to remember what we're doing. We're also within an energy efficiency program, we have installed in one of the railway stations LED lights powered by solar energy with batteries as well. We're doing the analysis on that pilot project, and if we believe that we have great results, then we will move forward to implement the same technology in other train stations. If I have some time left, let me just say that we are promoting from Trenes Argentinos, we are promoting and pushing for the Transport Ministry to enter into an agreement with the Science and Technology Ministry so that we can have a hydrogen-powered train. Hopefully Gustavo Rinaldi will help us with that. If I'm out of time, then that is it for me.
You can speak again later on. But in terms of infrastructure, I would like to give the floor from Correo Argentino, Diego Modigian, Innovation Director and Technological Services Director. Thank you very much. Hello to all the panelists and all the members of the forum. The idea of my participation is to tell you a little bit about how we are tackling decarbonization in our company, anchoring our 2020-2030 strategic plan. We are moving ahead with the transformation of our logistics with a very ambitious plan, the last mile ambition. That is the last part, the last section of the deliveries. What is our objective? Is to regulate, to have our deliveries to have the ability to distribute and deliver packages and letters in a sustainable way by the end of 2025. To reduce the carbon footprint, we need to reduce not just the amount of travels that we do and programming all the routes, but also the nature of the fleet itself. That is why we started off the electrification of our vehicles in order to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. What is the outlook that we have pinpointed and the one that we are working on? Of course, the pandemic accelerated many processes that were underway. The increase of e-commerce also generated a change of the purchasing patterns of people. People do not buy things from the closer stores, but they tend to use e-commerce more with an exponential growth, specifically during the pandemic. All of this growth brings about new delivery modalities. Today, out of the 2 million packages that we move around and that we deliver, the highest percentage are delivered on the very same day, on the next day. So this creates a pollution level which is much higher, and of course, traffic congestion, right? Traffic jams. All of this at the same time creates higher emission. In order to address this topic, we created hubs, which are small logistics centers where the goal is to reduce during the night time and evening and early morning time, to reduce everything related to logistics. In that way, there is an order, and of course, all the deliveries are conducted on the very same day, but the advantages of these hubs is we connect them and assign them to a vehicle that is proper to conduct all deliveries and does not create pollution. What are the aspects that we take into account and we select the vehicles? First, we need to consider the speed of the delivery, the geographical aspect, of course, because we have more than 1,500 facilities. We are the flagship mailing company of the country. We are located everywhere with different weathers and with different structures. We reach the farthest locations that you can possibly imagine. Of course, the size of the packages and the autonomy and the size of the delivery itself. We launched 5 models of sustainable mobility. I don't know if I can share my screen. Yes, of course, go ahead. You have 2 minutes left. Okay, can you see my screen? Yes. Yes, we can see your screen. It's not in the presentation mode, though. Yes, down there below. What are the vehicles that we are adding? Our cart that we use for distribution in the downtown area where there are restrictions, traffic restrictions. The capacity is 180 liters and the size of the package 45 centimeters. These sort of vehicles are thought not just in terms of sustainable mobility, but also in the people that have to actually do this work. And the electric bicycle, we have more than 400 bikes with a maximum speed of 25 kilometers and autonomy of 40 kilometers. There's another model, which is very similar to the one before, but the capacity for packages is larger. These are the motorcycles that we are adding. We actually start to add them as of next month for same day or next day deliveries. And this is the latest model that we are testing out. One of the largest models, a tri-cargo motorbike with a 2,000 liters capacity, 35 kilometers per hour maximum speed, and an autonomy of 100 kilometers. I would like also to share, if I have the time, we're not just working on the modality shift, but also we are combining our decarbonization strategy with the value of sustainability that Dr. Melena Yolanda Rendero is trying to implement. We are resuming all the projects and recycling all the materials. We have the largest digitalization plant in Argentina, and we are working strongly in trying to eliminate all the use of paper. We have a green project taking into account that not all deliveries are urgent. So that is what we are doing from our commercial line. Thank you very much. Thank you, Diego. As regards vehicles, we'll move along and we'll give the floor to Francisco Espázaro from Iveco, Argentina. He will provide a presentation. Thank you. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone here present. For us, it's an honor to be able to tell you in the next couple of minutes what Iveco is doing in terms of sustainability today. My name is Francisco Pazarro. Well, I have a commercial position. I work within a work team so that all of this becomes a reality, so that the vehicles are being sold with natural gas, compressed natural gas. Natural gas is a reality that can be implemented today, and that in this most likely be there will be a technology that will be replace this. If Iveco, you know, this brand is an international brand that manufactures trucks. It has manufactured trucks since 1969 in Cordoba province without any interruption. And taking up all the comments that have been made before where Argentina has been addressed. Argentina is quite a large country. 90% of transport is conducted via trucks. We are a local manufacturer, so this puts us a great responsibility so that we can supply all this sector with an alternative product, which is at the same time a feasible alternative for Argentina. Iveco is the first company that was accepted by the government to export and import trucks. Is the only company that manufactures trucks in Cordoba. We manufacture a Tecto truck, 200 horsepower, that has been manufactured in Cordoba since March last year. Iveco is the only company that provides products in all the segments, the light duty vehicles, Tecto in Cordoba, and Stratus, the heavy duty vehicles. All of these products have been traded for the last couple of years. The learning curve for us is to break through this paradigm of the coal, gas oil, fuel. There are many doubts. That is why what Francisco said before as regards complementary measures in order to help the introduction of this sort of technology. In Argentina, there is quite an important measure, the decline of tariffs to manufacture compressed natural gas vehicles. There is a decree that will expire by the end of next year, the end of this year. As I said before, the learning curve is slow. 250 units have been sold in 2 years, where in the usual market, the sales amounts to 250,000. We are not a full range company. We have a freight capacity vehicles of 2.3 tons. We have only sold 250 vehicles in a 300,000 vehicle market. Why did Iveco choose gas for Argentina? At the international level, we have been working for more than 20 years in different technologies. There are gas power vehicles and hybrid vehicles in Europe, hydrogen power vehicles in Europe. But when we decide to introduce a new technology in a country, one should only not just consider what the pollution source is. In our case, we started 5 years ago, and we had to determine if that energy is greener from well to wheel, as we said before, but also what is the final stage of the vehicle, the life cycle. In this case, these vehicles are electric power, and also how we dispose of the vehicles should be taken into account. In Argentina, there is availability of gas in Vaca Muerta with more than 200 years available of production. So the resource is available, not just as a natural resource, but also in terms of infrastructure. There are over 2,000 gas stations distributed along the country with natural compressed gas. That gas gets to the gas stations through piping, through pipes. So the way the fuel gets to the gas stations is also green. In Argentina, one advantage is that the price of gas has quite a huge differential with gas oil. 60% less is the cost. So besides the ecological advantages, there is some sustainability because 60% less of the cost of the fuel. In Argentina, fuel accounts for 40% of the total cost of transport. That is quite important. Technology has advanced with more than 2 million cars that have been refurbished. Of course, we have trucks that have been manufactured to use gas from the very beginning. We know that gas works for mobility in Argentina, as we saw in the transport of passengers. And from the transport company point of view, we need to take into account that all the improvements should be similar so that they are in an equal footing, not just in terms of charge, but charge time and the availability of fuel, and of course, an affordable cost. An electrical truck, as it was said before, is 3 times the cost of a diesel truck. So all of these factors make Argentina, in terms of gas and transport, is a feasible alternative. In the liquid natural gas, there is no availability of this sort of fuel at the local level, and this liquid gas is not an alternative. So I won't go any further so that they don't scold me. Thank you.
Thank you, Francisco. Now moving on from the private to the public sector, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Jorge Armendáriz from the province of San Juan. He's the Secretary of Transport of the province of San Juan. Jorge, you have the floor. Well, it seems that Jorge cannot hear me. Well, it does seem like Jorge is having some technical issues or connection issues. So what I will do is give the floor back to the 3 panel members who have already spoken. I would like to highlight that this panel has highlighted the importance of infrastructure and inter and multimodality, the impact in the last mile logistics, particularly when we increase the distances. Jorge, can you hear me, Jorge? Whenever you want, you can take the floor, okay? We cannot hear you, Jorge. We unfortunately cannot hear you. Your microphone seems to be off.
Buenas, Jorge. ¿Se escuchas?
Jorge, can you hear us? Right, we cannot hear you, however. While you try to sort that out, we will then give the floor back to the other speakers, but then at the end you'll have the opportunity to speak. Right. I would like to give the floor back to Mr. Guido Sanchez from ADIF. And please, Guido, I don't know if you have any final remarks that you would like to share with us, but you can take the floor and have the floor back. Well, based on Correo Argentino's presentation, I thought that in many cases, promoting bicycle use depends on having a place to store your bike safely. So if we can actually think about storage, bicycle storage locations, like the one we're building, in the case of SOCE, we have built already 14 bike warehouses or storage locations that have already been built, and we're planning to build another 14, so we can perhaps conceive of a place to store things like that in Correo Argentino. Thank you, Guido. Diego from Correo Argentina, perhaps you can reply to that. Yes, of course. The idea, Guido, that we can share the space with Gustavo and Francisco is to start coordinating among us and to try to carry out and put into practice all these things that are not only related to mobility, but also to the fact that we understand climate change and we are strongly betting on decarbonization, and we want to be net zero emissions. We're working on clean energy initiatives, and our idea and our commitment, not only as a government or state-run company, but also as a company, is to change and to start walking the walk and talking the talk, right? We are making huge efforts. We have had to deliver vaccines. That was something essential during the pandemic. We have coordinated and worked hand in hand with technologies and trying to reach remote places and remote locations. And our experience makes it possible for us to start opening up to new technologies. We have included and incorporated a new business unit, a marketplace of the Correo Compras, and we are making the most of this situation. So we're working on that, and we are trying to use the transport's negative hours, because Francisco, perhaps we can later talk about this together when it comes to large transport. We want to reduce our emissions, and we manage our trucks in non-peak or valley hours. So we reduce the time and the amount of time that our trucks are traveling in our trunk cities throughout the country. So I think this is a great opportunity, and hopefully we will be open to any further conversations or agreements in which we can continue to walk along this new path. Thank you, Diego. I would like to give the floor to Francisco now from Iveco. Thank you. I'll take these minutes to say that gas-powered vehicles also have another advantage from the contractor's perspective, because the thing that changes is the fuel that they use. This is not a diesel engine that they have, but it's a fuel-based engine. But from the user standpoint, it's not such a violent or drastic change when it comes to comparing it to electric vehicles. And as Gustavo Rinaldi mentioned, if we analyze how the transition is included in the country's national industrial variables, because as it's the same technology in the vehicles, when it comes to natural compressed gas, it is easily incorporated because it's just an engine with a different technology that uses a different fuel. We could even use bio natural compressed gas and natural liquefied gas. We have in our country the possibility to transform organic matter into bio LNG. And of course, we will not be at the level of Vaca Muerta, but we can go way beyond to have cleaner emissions, particularly when it comes to carbon emissions. And if I may, if you give me just a second, I would like to show you. I think you're probably seeing this. These are the range of products that we have in Argentina that are being sold for the past 2 years. To the left of the screen, to the right of the screen, we have the daily range which is an imported range that comes from Italy that works with bio-CNG and CNG, and then Stralis, who works with bio-CNG, CNG, LNG, and bio-LNG, and the Tector brand that can work with bio-CNG and CNG. Some of the important, I don't know if you can see that I changed the screen, but we have sold in the Neuquén area, as Maria Rosa mentioned. Neuquén is one of the provinces in which we have operations focused on Vaca Muerta by transporting frac sands. We have an agreement with Energy Argentina as a company. This is a local service where we transport sands from Entre Rios to the south, or you might see some of our trucks in some waste pickup trucks. This entails a benefit when it comes to reducing sound pollution. And this works at night. We have sold trucks to Latin America, for example, to Chile. As Ana spoke before, we have sold our first 35 trucks that work with liquefied natural gas for AB InBev in Santiago. So it is comforting for me to know that the work that we have carried out in recent times is completely aligned with this working group. And we know that compressed natural gas is a reality today. We cannot keep waiting to have zero polluting technologies to start doing things. Nowadays, logistics transports in Argentina have options to move forward towards decarbonization and fewer emissions. Thank you, Francisco. I would like to try to hear Jorge again. Jorge, perhaps we can hear you now. Hello. Yes, we can hear you now. No, thank you. We had a technical issue with the microphone. We've changed it, so I would like to say hi to everyone. I am Jorge Armendáriz. I'm the Transit and Transport Secretary of San Juan, and we have become a part of these new initiatives on electromobility. And a month ago, less than a month ago, we have included in our public transport system 2 e-buses, electric buses. The new thing about this is that these electric buses are charged with clean energy. In San Juan, we have many solar panel stations, and we will soon begin to build solar panels in San Juan. And the charging station has been set up right by a solar farm. So these 2 buses are being powered by electric energy, solar energy. So the idea is to include in the public transport system more electric buses. We are assessing this and trying to see how the charging process works and responds so that we don't have any inconveniences. And the province's governor has tasked us to perhaps by the end of the year incorporate or add to the grid another 20 to 30 e-buses. So I just wanted to share with you that in San Juan, we are creating a new public transport system. We have changed the whole of the mobility of San Juan province because we try buses not to get inside the downtown area of the city of San Juan, so that we can have a city that is enjoyed by foot. So that is the experience that we're working on in San Juan, and hopefully we will be able to contribute from the Secretariat to include cleaner, newer energies. Thank you so much, Jorge. You're welcome.
So I think that it is clear from today's panel that there are many challenges ahead, but there are also many opportunities ahead in Argentina and in the whole of the region. And I think that we can, and we're up to the challenge, to facing that global challenge. I would like to thank the 4 panel members of this session, Guido, Diego, Francisco, and Jorge. Thank you so much for your remarks, your comments, your time. And I think that without further ado, then we can move on to the closure of this event. We will hear some remarks from Rodrigo Tornquist, the Secretariat of Climate Change, Sustainable Development and Innovation of the Argentina's Ministry of Environment, who will give us some closing remarks. Thank you so much.
Estimadas y estimados, desde el Ministerio de Ambiente y Desarrollo Sostenible de la
From
Nación,
the Environmental and Sustainable Ministry of Argentina, we would like to thank the Ministry of Transport and the International Transport Forum for all their work. We extend this gratitude to the Wuppertal Institute and the Ministry of Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety of Germany. We would like to thank all the representatives of the different public and private sectors of the countries that have participated, including Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, and the United Kingdom. The report that was presented today is quite important for the decision-making and communication. Being together here virtually from different sectors is quite enriching and undoubtedly provides us an opportunity for lesson exchange and learning. Sharing experiences is necessary to move from planning, facing climate change and all the challenges this entails. This report states scenarios that were set last year adjusted to the Argentine reality, a country with many complexities, both because of the economic aspect, but also for the different realities. A high population concentration in urban areas in a reduced area of the territory with quite a large geography. And while there are many opportunities, there are also many challenges in terms of human sustainable development. As it was mentioned before by Johnny and Francisco, this model enables us to plan transport and up to 2050. This kind of exercise is quite important because it makes us think in terms of decades, not just in terms of years or 5-year period. So this is the correct approach to face the challenges ahead. It is relevant both in transport and the climate agenda to take into account the territory, the interrelations, and the dynamic processes that we are facing. The networks presented today allows us to model the flows, and Argentina is also included in the change of freight changes. So freight will reduce by 55% in terms of commodities transported. And this will also mean a lot of challenges in terms of innovation to adapt our logistics system, our infrastructure, our collective systems, adapt them to the climate change conditions, and to do so in a low emission context, in line with the goals of climate mitigation. E-commerce is here to stay, and these results also show that e-commerce is one of the main sectors that has been growing in the last couple of years. If we do not take into account and we do not implement corrective measures in the sector, this will worsen global warming, and it will be very difficult to reach the goal of limiting the increase of temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. In the Beijing Declaration, there was the statement of sustainable development, and the pandemic should present an opportunity to modify the freight and passenger transport in a more globalized and more digitalized world. So we should work to this end, taking into account that all this area of the state need to work together with the provincial and local governments, the private and the public sector, the academia and the civil society. No one single sector can be prepared for what is coming. We need to work together to prepare for the future in terms of climate change that would enable us also to recover our economies in very concrete ways. The Beijing Declaration states that this cooperation should be based on science and evidence. All the initiatives in this report are targeted to this end. It is important to have knowledge, move around, and to share experiences in the emissions for different stakeholders, which enable us not just to have evidence to implement measures in terms of transport, but also to create joint relations, cross-border relations to improve the livelihoods of the inhabitants, which in the end is our goal. So that is why we welcome the presence of representatives of Argentina, Chile, Brazil, and Colombia, because this dialogue must be regional, because we live in the same area and we are part of this common household where we live and should be the beacon of our constant care. The commitment of ITF shows us that it is possible to decarbonize transport, which will entail an economic effort, of course. We should take into account new participation of the energy sector and waterway sector to be able to reduce emissions by 50% by 2050 compared to 2015. Besides the joint effort, we need to work on the demand too. The world today is bombarded with consumption messages. We should be efficient as to how we communicate this, and we should also propose better methods. Without changing the patterns of consumption, it will be very difficult to change course. Of course, we need to work on how to educate consumers and users by fostering a change of mindset so that we can make better and informed decisions on how to consume in a more sustainable way, both for production and for transport and for the final result. We should not forget that sustainable development should be fair. The first goal is to reduce poverty and to fairly distribute the goods, but it's essential to have fair opportunities of development for inhabitants, especially for those groups that have been most vulnerable. To be able to access to better jobs in safer environments is an additional challenge for emerging countries, but it goes hand in hand with decarbonization goals. We won't achieve one without the other one. In this sense, the transport sector should be a transformative tool and part of the transformation, trying to improve the quality of life for everyone on an equal footing. To close up, I would like to thank all the participation of the ITF, the Ministry of Transport, and for emphasizing the need of decarbonizing transport in the country. I invite you all to continue working and to be able to implement the strategy of 2030-2050. Thank you all. I'll give the floor again to John Pritchard, the moderator. Thank you. Okay, so we have some other words from the Ambassador of the United Kingdom, Mrs. Christy Hayes. It's an honor to address this webinar in the same event as the Secretary of Climate Change, Rodrigo Royce-Tornquist, who has worked with us extensively in the last couple of months in this major topic. As the United Kingdom Ambassador, I am very pleased for having the opportunity to close this event. I thank the Ministry of Transport and the International Transport Forum for the invitation and for organizing this meeting on one of the key aspects for climate action, electric mobility. As you know, the United Kingdom will chair the upcoming negotiations of climate change COP26 in Glasgow. And we started with the World Leaders Summit next week. Before the summit, the government of the United Kingdom announced last week a historical landmark strategy, net zero, which will unlock 90 billion pounds in investment by 2030 to achieve the goal of putting an end of its contribution to climate change by 2050, including 1 billion pounds to support the transition of electric vehicles and the supply chain, as well as for subsidies and specific infrastructure for electric vehicles, specifically charging points in the public areas with plans of selling thousands of vehicles and vans of zero emissions in the roads. Global emissions of vehicles account for more than 10% of the total. To change the situation, it's essential for countries and domestic stakeholders commit that all the new cars are zero emissions by 2040 or before. As we saw today, Argentina has a key role to play in achieving a fast global change towards zero-emission vehicles, that is to say, battery vehicles and fuel cell vehicles. With its high level of scientists and engineers and resources and research centers of lithium and proactive actions in hydrogen, Argentina can be at the forefront of countries by promoting low carbon level transport. Because of all of this, I am pleased to have all of these specialists that will present their visions on the topic of decarbonizing transport systems. The collaboration between countries is the only way to make this a success around the world. Once again, thank you very much and congratulations everyone for participating in such an interesting and relevant conference. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much. And now to close, I will give the floor to Francisco Furtado, the lead and the head of the project and of this report, so that he can convey his message. Francisco, the floor is yours.
Thank you, John. The first thing to say here is thank you to everyone that participated in this workshop, in this event, from the partners that are involved in the project, BMU, Wuppertal Institute, to all the countries' representatives that were here, the representatives from companies, from institutions in Argentina. All of them gave an important contribution. I also like to mention some colleagues from the ITF. Elizabeth that spoke, and she was the overall lead of the DT project. My colleagues also in the communications team, they were very important in getting this publication out and many of the other things we have. And by the way, I saw somebody, for those that are wondering, this report that I presented, and John, it is available online. It's on the chat. You can click on the link and you can download this report. And also a special thanks to my colleague Diana, which she's behind the office. Many of you that participated got emails from Diana, so she's also here and helping in the back office of this event. Of course, I think this publication now is launched. The publication is done for the scenarios. But the project, and I think Gustavo was alluding to that, the project is not over. There's still at least another year and a half in this project. So, and I think this will be a good opportunity to deepen some of the discussions we already had today. And we have been having since the beginning of this project, actually. Some of them featured prominently in the conference we did last year. But things like the role of intermodal transport, the role of rail, of inland waterways, this is certainly something that we should deepen, and we should now discuss not only the results we saw in these scenarios, but what's behind them, and also what's the feasibility of implementing it. And as we saw, I think in the region in Latin America, I think there's a great, but of course, these are costly infrastructure to deploy, but they also have a big potential in terms of regional integration. Then also this discussion, it was a bit alluded of the different alternatives. There were some representatives talking about hydrogen, others saying we need a ready-to-use solution, and in the specific conditions of Argentina, gas is a solution. I must say internally, like a bit of view behind the screens, internally, even in the ITF, this generated, there's always some heated discussions around this topic, but I think it's something that should definitely, it's worthwhile a deeper investigation in this project. And then, I mean, I have to also thank very much the Argentinian authorities. And we had here people from the Transport Ministry, from the Environment Ministry, we've been doing this project. There's been 2 different governments already in Argentina, but we always had the support. Argentina, of course, some of the priorities might change a bit, some of the perspectives on this, it's natural that it does. But from the beginning, across different governments, there's always been this commitment to the decarbonization, to alleviate climate change, and also to decarbonize transport. This is something I would like to highlight. And our relationship and the ITF relationship with Argentina has all throughout this project, and even before, has always been very productive. And I think this is something to signal out and to mention. I should also mention Chile, which is another ITF member country, and that has always been very present. And we hope that Brazil, in the past conference we organized, there was also Brazilian representatives, and Brazil is not yet a member of the ITF, but it's an observer of the ITF. And I think it's, given its size, it's absolutely determinant for the region and for the world, I would say, not just the region, but even the world. I think in Brazil's role, it's absolutely decisive. And I hope that you keep involving and participating in these events. And I think that the relationship between the ITF in this project, but overall, keeps increasing. A last note is that I will be leaving the ITF actually tomorrow. So this is my last, actually my last event, my last action as an official of the International Transport Forum was this setting up this publication and this event. But the work goes on, the show goes on, and my colleague John Preacher will be leading this work going forward. And without further ado, I'll pass the word to John that will tell you about the future steps in this project.
Thank you very much, Francisco. As you said, the project is not over yet. And there's still a lot of work to do in Argentina. Among the key things that we want to do moving forward is that we want to explore the results of this modeling work and really look at the feasibility and the governance needed to implement these scenarios within Argentina. And this will be the key next step in this project, is to really explore how, now we modeled what could be the impacts of these different policies to decarbonize transport in Argentina, in particular the decarbonized freight transport in Argentina. But the key thing is now, how do we move this forward? And this will be the next step in our project. that we will be pursuing. Additionally, we also want to provide additional tools to the Ministry of Transport in Argentina, where they can explore a lot of these results that we presented today in a lot more detail. And this is something else we'll be doing with some workshops with the Ministry of Transport over the next year. So just to finish up, there's a small treat, y quizás ahora cambio para el español. Y es que es nuestro gran honor presentar.
It's an honor for us to present some new prizes that we are presenting in this DTE project, the Decarbonizing Awards. The first one is of 5,000 euros for research within emerging economies countries. And another one is an award for innovation of 10,000 euros for all the participants. They must come from emerging economies. All of the countries participating in this event are considered emerging economies, and we are using the UN definition. We'll provide more details in the upcoming weeks, but we wanted to announce this today. So with that, I would like to thank all the participants and all the audience and all of the panelists. Without them, this would not have been possible. So with that, thank you very much and have a wonderful afternoon or a wonderful day. Thank you very much.